I think so.
Awesome.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Can't complain. How are you doing?
All right. You have Horizons right here.
Excellent. So should I just stumble right in, or how would you all like me to do this?
I will briefly recap the bio that I sent out to the class, your bio, but
Okay.
So thank you for being here. As you guys know, so Mike has been on the Forbes Midas list since 2010 and was also named one of the 8 rising stars by Fortune magazine. And before becoming a full-time investor, Mike was involved as a founder and operating executive at back-to-back startup IPOs, including Tivoli Systems, acquired by IBM, and Motive, acquired by Alcatel-Lucent. And some of Mike's investments include Twitter, Twitch, Weebly, Check, Bazaarvore, Spiceworks, and a bunch more. And Mike is known for coining the term thunder lizards, which I'm sure he'll talk about today, a metaphor derived from Godzilla, and something that he uses to look for great companies. So Mike, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Let's see. So I'm going to kind of just plunge right in, and if there's a natural point in time to do Q&A, that's fine. You know, I'm probably not overly rehearsed, to be honest. You know, I guess when I step back, I think that a lot of people, when they get involved with tech startups, make a fundamental mistake. Well, 2 fundamental mistakes. One is they don't pursue exceptional enough ideas and people and opportunities. And then number 2 is they tend to follow the crowds rather than to think independently for themselves. And if you could become very good at always pursuing legendary exceptionalism and always committing yourself to having your own point of view and not having your reflex be to want to look like other people or want to do what other people are doing, if you can master just those 2 things, chances are you're going to have a top decile career, regardless of whether you're in startups or in big companies or whatnot. So from those 2 guiding principles, I've sort of developed a set of frameworks for thinking about how to build a company and how to invest in companies in tech. And so maybe what would be helpful is if I just kind of walked through what some of those frameworks are.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And in the spirit of thinking for yourselves, you can decide whether you want to pay attention to them or be contrarian to them. The first thing that I pay a lot of attention to is what I call the 3 exponential laws that animate tech. One of the things that is frustratingly counterintuitive to me is that we live our lives in linear ways. You know, we brush our teeth every morning, we drive to work every morning. Most of what we observe in the typical day-to-day rhythm of our lives is linear in its orientation. Most of our life is linear. We go to grade school, then we go to middle school, then we go to high school, then we go to college, then we go to grad school, and we try to go to the best one that we can each time and try to get the best grades that we can each time and try to achieve the most that we can each time. But the tech industry is animated by exponential forces. The first exponential force is Moore's law. Probably many of you are familiar with that. Moore's law basically states that the power of computing doubles every 18 months at a given price. Moore's law is so embedded in our industry that we almost take it for granted. But the reason that Moore's law is profound is that Moore's law guarantees that there will be a new supply of innovative, disruptive, huge new companies in every tech cycle. No matter how powerful an incumbent is, Moore's law is exponential. Give Moore's law enough time and it will breach the incumbent advantage of any company in the world. No incumbent company can withstand the exponential power of Moore's law when it is directly applied to disrupting its business. And Moore's law and the entrepreneur's willingness to leverage it as a weapon is the asymmetric attack vehicle of the startup. A closely related law that is similar in nature is Metcalfe's law. How many of you have heard of Metcalfe's law? Okay, so fewer. So Metcalfe's law is a law of network effects. Bob Metcalfe was a co-inventor of the Ethernet, and Metcalfe's law states that the power of a network is a function of the square of the number of nodes in the network. And so, network effect businesses leverage the fact that for every new member that joins the network, the exponentiality and power of the network increases in a nonlinear way. Whenever I look at a startup, that's my first order question. In what way are you leveraging Moore's law and or Metcalfe's law to create an asymmetric attack vector to go after a new market opportunity? You'd be surprised at how many startups can't answer that question. And I'm like, if you can't answer that question, you kind of almost can't pass go, because there's no valid reason to believe. The incumbents always have a huge number of advantages. They have customer bases, they have distribution, they have financial resources, they have people, and there has to be some type of a disruptive attack vector that they cannot counter for the startup to have a valid reason to exist in the market.
My question.
Yeah.
Question about it. Do you think that entrepreneurs set out to leverage these laws? Like they're thinking of their idea and they say, all right, is this going to leverage Moore's law or Metcalfe's law? Or do you think that they then get started on it and then think about how what they're doing leverages them?
I think it's a combination. But I think that you can always look back at these startups and point to an exponential force, either in a pre-meditated.
Okay, got it.
So I go back now. Are you guys okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, cool. The third exponential is more of a. It's called the power law. And the power law states in a given set of outcomes, the largest outcome bigger than all the other combined outcomes, and the next largest outcome than the remaining outcomes. And so power law like this. Biggest outcome looks like that. Goes like that. To give you a sense in action. In a typical startup year, 10,000 companies get started. The most valuable company is more valuable than all 10,000. In a typical startup, the most valuable company is more valuable than all created in that decade. Paul Graham at White said the most.
Yeah, we have a little bit of an audio problem now, I think. Is it possible to get closer to the mic on your end? I'm wondering.
Okay, I think I'm pretty close.
Or maybe we can mute ourselves for now.
Sorry about that. Yep. Is that better?
Yeah, so we're going to try to mute ourselves for now until we have questions.
Okay, great. So just wave to get my attention when you want me to. When you want. Okay. So got it. Okay. So the power law is frustratingly counterintuitive. Most investing follows what's called a normal distribution. You have a bell curve, it looks kind of like this, and you have kind of your middle of the road outcomes, and then your high outcomes and your low outcomes. That's not how venture capital works. That's not how startups work in tech. It is a business of extraordinary radical exceptionalism. So in what we found in our research is that the number one company of a startup year generates half of the profits in the industry or more. And that the top 10 companies out of 10,000 generate 97% of the value in the business. So startup investing, in my view, is all about finding those top 10 companies of the year. There is nothing else. There is no other objective function. And I would argue that if you're a startup entrepreneur, the goal should be either to start one of those companies or join one of those companies. And I'm not saying that out of arrogance. I'm saying that out of humility. Why would you ever want to fight with 9,900 other people over 3% of the scraps? It makes no sense. And so it is irrational not to try to be involved with the top 10 outcomes in a given year. And so my whole investment theories and strategies and how I work with founders is all about how do you find those hyper exceptional companies, and how do you help them achieve their potential. And one of the heuristics that I use is I try to help founders think about what I call their value stack. And so value stack literally is a hierarchy of powers. At the bottom of the value stack is what I call proprietary power. Proprietary power is the thing that lets you avoid competition. I like to say it's more important to be different than to be better. And my view of how proprietary power happens is an entrepreneur leverages Moore's law or Metcalfe's law in a compelling way that's hard for other people to copy. So if you're leveraging Moore's law, it's usually you have a technology that very few people in the world can copy. If you're using Metcalfe's law, you're creating a network effect that if you get first mover and you execute well, you get scale advantages that nobody can compete with. So like when Twitter started to get scale, Google bought Jaiku, which competed with Twitter, but there was nothing Google could do to stop Twitter with Jaiku, because it wasn't about how much money Google had. It was about the network effect that Twitter was building. Similarly, Windows began to get a network effect in operating systems. IBM spent billions of dollars trying to beat them with OS2, didn't matter. Microsoft spent billions of dollars trying to beat Google search with Bing, didn't matter. So once a network effect is achieved, you can't throw money at a competitive offering. The network effect is too powerful. So that's proprietary power. Product power is the thing that delights customers about your product. You know, people talk in Silicon Valley a lot these days about product market fit, but in my view, product market fit is no longer enough. There's too many startups. And so I call it having a WTF experience. And so like for example, have any of you ever been in a Tesla self-driving car? Okay, so first time I ever did it, right? You double click back the cruise control stalk and it goes boom, boom, and starts driving itself. And like the first time, you know, we invested in Lyft in the seed round, and this was before UberX copied Lyft. First time I ever took a Lyft ride, I knew we were going to make a ton of money on that deal, because it was just like after you take one ride on a Lyft or an Uber, you're like, screw taxis. And so a WTF experience is so powerful and compelling that it not only is compelling to the customer, but it changes their point of view about what things should be. It causes them to never want to go back to the old way of doing it. There are a lot of other ways to achieve product power. We can talk about in the Q&A. But next level up is company power. It's the things that you do to enable the company to scale at a massive rate if your idea succeeds. It involves things like, do we define our culture proactively or do we just let it happen? It involves how we think about recruiting, how we think about compensation, how we think about the types of meetings that we have, the way we set goals, the way we empower people. One of my favorite elements of company power is what I call hot teams. And so when I was a kid, they started to study how NASA landed on the moon. And probably none of you was born before 1969. But just try to imagine that we landed on the moon in 1969 and HP hadn't even invented the pocket calculator yet. And got somebody back. So I became very interested in how the hell did that happen? Like, how did we do that? And I found this study on this concept called hot teams. And they talked about how some of the teams in NASA were 1,000 times more productive than a typical team. And so they wanted to know why. And so they had one example where some people had to put an antenna on the top of a mountain, and there were no roads to the bottom of the mountain. And so somebody on the team said, what are we going to do? We're going to miss our deadline. We better tell our boss that we're behind. And somebody else on the team said, if we tell management, we'll never get this done. They'll just waste our time. They'll just gum up the works with red tape. So somebody else on the team says, okay, who has the biggest helicopter in the entire world? And they do some research and they figure out that it's the US Navy. So NASA calls up the US Navy and they say, hey, can we borrow one of your helicopters? We need to assemble this antenna. And the Navy says, screw you, NASA, right? There are helicopters, pound sand. So the NASA guys say, okay, here's the deal. JFK said we're going to land on the moon in 1969. And if we don't get this antenna up on the top of the mountain within the next 2 weeks, we're going to be behind on the project. We're going to miss the deadline. We're not going to land on the moon in time. And so then the Navy says, how many do you need? And so they loan them all of their big helicopters. So NASA puts all the parts of the antenna into these helicopters and flies them up to the top of the mountain and makes the antenna. And so the NASA moon landing was like 1,000 examples of that. And so hot teams are teams that feel extraordinarily empowered to achieve a mission that they are absolutely committed to. And what you have happen in a lot of companies is teams come up with excuses not to ship on time. Teams come up with reasons not to accomplish something. And what I learned from hot teams was a few important things. One is mission clarity. The goal has to be super important, and you have to believe that you can make it happen. And not only that, it won't happen without you. And it's not about performance reviews, and it's not about excuses or reasons. It's about, we got to get this done and we're doing it for each other. But the second thing has to do with how you empower teams. So the way I applied this thinking to the startups I worked with was I said, management can define the feature set of a product or the ship date, but not both. And so we could say, look, it's got to ship by Christmas because it's a consumer product. But if we did that, then we let the team define completely on their own what would be in the product. And then conversely, we might say, okay, well, this is a product that's got to be mission critical. It's got to have this certain set of features. Then we let the team define the date that it had to ship. The reason that you want to do that is that a hot team, when they encounter obstacles, which they will, you don't want them to say, well, gee, this is totally unrealistic. Management gave me these features by this date. There's no way we could get this done. And then what they do is they spend time coming up with reasons not to get it done and arguing and debating about how unfair it is, or like how we should change stuff, or we need to have a meeting about this. Hot teams say, look, management told us we have to ship this by Christmas. We define the features. Yeah, we've encountered this roadblock. It's not management's fault. It's our fault. It's up to us to fix it. We owe it to each other to ship on time. And I can't even believe it. We're having this conversation about not shipping by Christmas. And so hot teams have this empowerment. And the reason it's so important to have mission clarity in a big mission is it has to be important enough that hot teams will do whatever it takes to make it happen. And that's another reason that I want to invest in companies that I like to say the world is going to have a high give a shit factor about, because I know that those teams will do what it takes when they're empowered to kick ass and cut through the crap. And those are the kinds of teams that you want to be on when you're a developer. And those are the types of teams that you can recruit the very best people in the world to join. Okay, so moving up a layer is category power. Category power has to do with influencing ultimately the way people spend their money. Starbucks created a category for high-priced coffee. The world used to believe you pay 50 cents for coffee. Now they somehow believe that you should pay $4 for a latte. Category kings are the people who define these categories and appropriate most of the money. The category king usually gets 80% of the profits in a category. Category kings exist not just in business, but they exist all over the place. Elvis was the category king of rock and roll. The other thing I've learned about category kings is they don't set out to disrupt, they set out to create. Elvis didn't set out to disrupt jazz. He set out to create rock and roll. Elon didn't set out to disrupt cars. He wanted to create electric cars that were awesome. The great genius of Steve Jobs in his second tenure at Apple is he invented 3 categories: the pocket music player, the smartphone, and the tablet. But category kings also change our point of view about, you know, what's possible as well. And usually they emanate from products that have a WTF experience. And so, like, my view is that when we work with startups, we're trying to help the startup become awesome at all those layers of the value stack through time. And by doing so, they're positioned to have a product that people love, that other people can't copy, that can be offered at great scale as the business scales its organization, and that then captures a dynamic spend and has, you know, a massive exit outcome. So other than that, there's about 1 million details, but maybe I ought to stop there if anybody has any questions.
Any questions from the class? I had a question for you, which is, you know, when you look for these frameworks, and you've talked, I think, about some of the companies that have already done very well in your portfolio. What are some of the companies that are just getting started or that you've just invested in that you think satisfies some of these conditions?
Yeah. So, and by the way, you never really know at the time. You know, it's you know, I like to make fun of people who are too certain about their knowledge, especially when it comes to startups. And if you want, I can tell some stories later on about startups that worked that I didn't think were working. That was pretty random. But I'd say that some companies that I've invested in recently that are showing signs. One is a company that's kind of stealthy called Origin. I'm a 3D printing skeptic for the most part, but these guys have created some software that lets commodity printers create output that looks as good as the output of $100,000 printers. And they've commoditized printers by open sourcing all the components and the software for the printer themselves. So, you know, if you're somebody in China, you can assemble one of these printers, and they're kind of trying to become the Microsoft of 3D printing. And I believe that in the world of the future, that people will 3D print more things than we anticipate. You know, everything from parts to screws to nuts and bolts to items that are manufactured in small lot sizes. So I think that this company has a chance to be very important because most companies are coming at 3D printing from the printing angle. And I think that the idea of commoditizing the printer the way Microsoft commoditized the PC and become the software that controls and powers it all could be pretty interesting.
So does that company have both the network and technology advantages?
Yeah, they have their technology advantage is their software is just extraordinarily kick-ass, and they just have a lot of proprietary know-how about how to write this software. It turns out that there's a very small number of people in 3D printing who really know how to write the best software. And so I've basically been finding all those people and saying, come to Papa, and trying to get them all in the same company. And so, and I feel like if I can do that, then all the other great people that emerge who write kick-ass software will want to come work with these people. So it's a little bit like my early days of Silicon Graphics. You know, 15 of the top 20 best graphic software programmers were at SGI, and 10 of the top 15 of the best hardware guys were at SGI. And so everybody who wanted to be involved with just absolute kick-ass insane graphics, Silicon Graphics is kind of like Mecca, right? That's where you wanted to be. So I think that we're succeeding at getting the very best minds in 3D printing software. The other thing I like about it, though, is it's kind of a contrarian play to say the hardware shouldn't matter someday. In fact, let's give the hardware away. You know, Carbon charges huge amounts of money for their proprietary materials that work only with their $100,000 printers. Let's give the recipe for materials away. Let's give the specs for the printer away. Let's give the software for the printing away, but then have our software integrate with every single 3D CAD package in the world, and have a button that says print to origin. And then it can print at an arbitrary level of quality. And so on any of these printers, wherever they exist in the world. So I like that company. I have no idea if it's going to work. It's hugely risky. It's like got 5 people right now. But I'm excited about that one. I'm excited about the idea of applying mapping technology to enterprise software, not just consumer. So I'm seeing a few enterprise software companies that are doing interesting things there. But, you know, they all look crazy early and risky in the early days. You know, they can go in 1,000 directions.
And you talked about your 97, well, the 97% of returns is generated by 10 companies every year rule. You've had a couple of funds right now. Can you give us some examples that just sort of crystallize that rule in terms of your portfolio of the companies that have delivered these outsized returns compared to other ones, and like what multiples those represented?
Yeah, so the first fund I ever did was my own money. And, you know, it had some good companies in it. It had Twitter, it had Dig, it had Aggregate Knowledge, it had Yumi Networks, and it had, what was the other one? Vizu. Vizu ended up, we made 5 times our money. Dig went out of business. Aggregate Knowledge got bought for $150 million. Yumi went public. Twitter went public. But what's interesting is the fund would have been a 5 to 10 times fund without Twitter if I'd done just those other deals. Twitter made 500 times. And so all the other ones could have gone to 0. And really all that mattered was that I invested in Twitter. Because in a fund that had 7 or 8 investments, you have one that does 500 times, you know, it just, everything else could go to 0. Maple's fund, the next fund that I did had Demand Force in it. Demand Force returned 3 times our first fund by itself. Lyft is worth 3 times fund 2 or fund 3. In venture, it's weird, you know, just your best outcomes are just these extreme outliers that cover up all your other sins. And, you know, I just almost don't think you can exceed in venture unless every fund has 1 or 2 companies like that just have the explosive breakout potential and realized outcome.
And looking back now, what was the common point between all of these outliers, how you initially felt about them, or maybe some things in common apart from the frameworks that you've talked about, whether it be with the founders or with the companies themselves? You know, have you found that there's something that links all of them?
You know, it's funny. I'd like to think that I can. So, like, I guess my view is that people tend to think they know more than they know. And particularly the more exponential and random an environment is. And so what I try to do is I try to come up with frameworks to cope with my ignorance. And so I kind of look at it like we're all ignorant about these forces, and that what we need are tools that allow us to avoid making rookie mistakes that rely on our intuition, where we have uninformed intuition, right? So the reason I pay attention to exponential laws and the reason I pay attention to the value stack framework is if I find a company that violates too much of that, I move on. But like, I like to say that, you know, I'm spotting these companies when they're at the atomic, you know, I like to call them thunder lizards. And the thunder lizards, the metaphor comes from Godzilla. Godzilla was hatched from radioactive atomic eggs, swam across the ocean and destroyed cities, breathed fire on buildings, swiped holes in things, ate train cars like they were sausage links. And like, I like to say my job is to spot atomic eggs. And I allow myself to relax about what it might mutate into, because I don't really know, right? But what I have to do is I have to look at startups that have super high potential energy and that are kind of setting off my Geiger counter with a lot of factors. But then I'm sort of willing to live with the ambiguity of what it's likely to become. So, you know, Twitter, before it was Twitter, was Odeo, which was a podcasting company. And I mean, here's a story to show you how random it is. I invested in Justin.tv when it was Justin Can. He walks into a coffee shop with a baseball cap and a camera on his head and wires going into a backpack full of hardware. I mean, it almost looked like we were gonna have to call security. And I say, Justin, what are you doing? And he says, I'm live casting my life. And I'm like, Justin, come on, that's stupid. And he's like, no, I'm live casting my life. And I'm like, well, how do you even do that? And he says, well, the internet's a hostile networking environment. And, you know, you have to do a bunch of things to make live video stream over the internet. This is back in 2007. And I said, look, I think this business idea is stupid, but I think that technology is really cool. And I think that live video on the internet's going to be a thing someday. And so I'll give you some money to go try this. So a couple years later, I get an email from him and he says, great news, we're pivoting. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, we're pivoting into two new companies. And I'm thinking, oh boy, this doesn't sound good. And he says, one of them's called Social Cam and the other's called Twitch.tv. And Social Cam and Twitch.tv made absolutely no sense to me. It made even less sense to me than Justin.tv. Social Cam ends up getting bought 6 months later for $70 million. So we made 10 times our money. And so I thought that was the company. And so I just forgot about Twitch and didn't even remember I was a shareholder. And 6 months later, I'm downstairs in the basement hanging out with my son, and he's on Twitch. And I'm like, huh, gosh, that name sounds familiar. And I'm like, tell me about this Twitch thing. And he's like, oh, all my friends are on it and blah, blah, blah. He's like, you should have invested in it, Dad, because I think this is going to be big. And I'm like, man, Twitch. And so I'm like, man, mate, gosh, let me go back through my emails. And so I Google search Twitch.tv in my Gmail. And sure enough, I'm a shareholder in Twitch. So I send Emmett Shear an email and I'm like, hey, Emmett, I just want to confirm the number of shares I have because I didn't know how many shares I had. I'm just doing some admin clerical work and just how many shares do you think I have? I want to see if it matches the number I think I have. And he goes, okay, here's how many shares you have. And I'm like, great, that's what I thought. And then 3 months later, the company gets bought by Amazon for $970 million. And we made 84 times our money on that one. And so there are days like that you wonder, what business am I even in? But you know, if I deserve any credit for that investment, it was, you know, sort of recognizing the exponential potential energy of the original idea, but not getting too hung up on how linear is the path to getting to, you know, product market fit. So I tend to like founders who are playing with weapons grade plutonium, but we haven't quite figured out what the weapon is. But like in a portfolio of 25 of those, only a few of them have to work for us to make good money because the ones that work spectacularly.
Does that mean that there are a lot of companies that you will pass on because they're good and you think they'll make 10x or 20x, but that they're not plutonium and that they won't sort of explode and become a 1000x company?
Correct. And so one of my advantages is, since I care about exponential, I can eliminate 9/10 of the pitches that come in and say, this isn't for me. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to ask, how can you tell if a company is only going to be 10 or 20x?
Well, you can't. I mean, like what happens a lot of times is you'll get a pitch that makes a lot of sense on paper. They'll say, okay, here's a customer. They have this pain point. We solve the pain. We save them money. We sell it direct. You know, here's the valuation you can invest at. You make 10 times your money if the company sells for $75 million. And I'm not interested in those, right? I'm interested in, this is a capitalist mutation, and it's probably going to be worth 0, but if it works, we're going to make 100 times. And we don't even really know how we're going to make 100 times, but we know that this has disruptive breakout potential, and it's so crazy it might work.
Got it. You earlier we chatted for a couple minutes before this, and you mentioned that you passed on some very successful companies. Did those companies satisfy the frameworks that you had, or I suppose did you not realize that they did, or did they only satisfy those after?
Well, that's the problem, and some of these frameworks I developed through time, through trial and error, right? So, and we can come back to that topic as well, because I think that most people, they make the mistake of not improving how they think over time. But so let's talk about the ones I passed on. The guys from Airbnb came into our office. At the time, it was called Air Bed and Breakfast. They were 2 guys. They came in with a bunch of cereal boxes, Obama O's and Captain Cane McCrunch. And I was like, hey guys, I thought you're Air Bed and Breakfast. What's up with these cereal boxes? And they said, well, we haven't been able to raise money. So the way we've funded the business so far is we've sold these, because it's the election between McCain and Obama. And I was like, okay, that's not so confidence inspiring, but oh well. And so I'm like, okay, what does Air Bed and Breakfast do? And they say, okay, here, check it out. Here's what happens. Somebody rents you a room in their house, and they give you an airbed, and then they serve you breakfast the next morning. Air Bed and Breakfast. And I was like, okay. And I was like, and what's your distribution strategy? They're like, we're going to blow up at the Democratic convention next week. Not enough hotels in Denver. We're going to blow up. And so, like, to our credit, I suppose, I was like, okay, this is crazy, but this is my kind of crazy. And so how about this? Let's schedule a call for Monday after the Democratic convention. And I want to walk through what your learnings are from the Democratic convention, and like whether there's a potential network effect to this. Well, they blew up at the Democratic convention, and Sequoia Capital was monitoring them and tracking them, and they gave them a term sheet before it did Sequoia's deal. And by the time Monday after the Democratic convention came, it was too late. And so I lost that one. That one hurts because I don't feel like I was being a bozo there. Pinterest, and my partner, Ann Miraco, comes into my office one day and says, I've made a terrible mistake. I passed on Pinterest, and it's going to be big. And I said, what's Pinterest? Like, I'd never heard of it. And she's like, you know, it's starting to really take off, especially among women. I think it's going to be big. I think we should go in there and just like go, you know, full metal jacket trying to win Pinterest. So she calls up Ben and she says, I'm pregnant and you got to take another meeting with me. If you don't, I'm going to go on a hunger strike. And so Ben's like, okay, no, don't go on a hunger strike, Ann. So we go meet with Ben. And I've rarely had this happen before. It's happened probably 2 or 3 times. But like when you're in a first meeting with a founder and you're like, it's just totally obvious to you, this is going to be huge. I mean, I remember sitting there with Ben thinking, this is going to be, this guy's going to be famous someday. He's going to be on the cover. He's going to be one of Time's 100 influencers. This is going to be, this thing is going to be massive. So we offered him a term sheet that day. It was the most expensive deal we'd ever done, the biggest offer we'd ever made. And Ben calls me up and says, look, you know, I'm sorry, but you're just not even close. And I'm like, Ben, but we're only diluting you 5% and we're giving you this great deal, this high price, and putting all this money in. And I mean, who's going to dilute you less than us? And he's like, just trust me. If you knew, you'd understand. Well, Mark Andreessen gave him $20 million at 200 pre. And our offer had been 5 at 75 post. And so he took Andreessen's deal. And then I ran into Mark a few weeks later, and I said, dude, why are you blowing me out of these deals like this? You're just crushing me. What's up with that? And he's like, oh, I didn't know anything about it. If you had told me that you were interested in Pinterest, we would have made room for you. And I thought he was BSing me. So when GitHub came along and I found out that Andreessen's going to win GitHub, I called up Mark and I said, all right, did you mean that? Because GitHub was one I saw back in 08. I could tell that story, how that got away too. That one hurts too. But Andreessen goes, no, I wasn't BSing you. I'd be happy to let you in on this GitHub deal. Mark and Ben, when we launched Floodgate, actually sent us a coffee maker to congratulate us for launching. But so I said, okay, I'm interested in GitHub. And I said, what are the parameters of the deal? He said, 50 million at 750 post. And I said, $750 million, that's outrageous. Like, that's just too expensive. And he's like, well, don't ever say I'm not letting you in on these things. And I was like, well, that price is outrageous. You've lost your mind. And he's like, well, do you want to do it or don't you? So I decided not to do it, but at least he kept his word. Yeah, so that one hurt. I passed on Zynga. Got very close to doing GitHub in 08. But then we scared him off. Yeah. So for everyone we've done that worked, there's been plenty that didn't.
Got it. But it seems that those that you passed on, like, at least you were sort of like, it was not a total pass and you saw something in there.
Usually, or, whenever a deal works or doesn't work, I try to do a post-mortem. And then similarly, when a deal works that we didn't do, I try to do post-mortem. And what I've learned is that people tend to be too confident of their knowledge of what's going to happen. There's a book that I like that came out recently called Super Forecasters. And it talks about how amateurs can almost always beat experts at forecasting if they're humble enough to continuously check and refine their assumptions. And so the value stack and a lot of the frameworks that I put together came largely out of coming up with tools to cope with my ignorance over time. And so, like, the value stack for me isn't an absolute. It's more of like a pre-flight check. It's sort of like, okay, when I was sober, I thought these things were important. And so how does this company line up? And then similarly, when a company does well, sometimes I'm like, okay, I got too fixated on the fact that the product was ambiguous, and I didn't pay enough attention to the exponential potential of the idea, and I should have just taken the leap of faith. And so to me, investing in startups and starting companies, it's so uncertain and so risky that the important thing is to know where you're taking a leap of faith and to be clear about that and to get comfortable with that. And then what I try to do over time is I try to say, is this thing working better than I thought or less well than I thought? And is it working better or worse because my leap of faith was wrong? I can live with that. Or is it working less well than I thought because there was something that I didn't think about, that I didn't factor in? But, I'm constantly trying to come up with tools to counter my ignorance.
And do you find that the really difficult part of the job is to see the deals, to sort of source them and to look where no one else is looking? Or is it really just in selecting? Do you find that you see all of the great companies out there, but then it's up to you to actually decide which ones to invest in?
The hardest part for me really has less to do with the deals. You know, the reason I got into venture was I loved doing startups, but I felt like, you know, I was too tired to do another one. And so I thought if I was an investor, I could be forever young. And so I really like working with founders. And so the hard parts for me are when it's not working and when the founder's struggling and when, you know, sometimes they'll go longer than they should because they're worried they're going to let me down. And, you know, I sort of look at it like, you didn't fail, the idea just failed. And, you know, these people, they put in, they put in the best years of their lives, and they sacrifice everything. And so I guess to me, the hard part is when it doesn't work and when you have to help them understand it's not going to work. And, that it's okay. It's okay in this circumstance to live to fight another day. I think those are the hard parts. You know, in terms of picking deals, my business is hard, but it's not complicated. You know, I just have to run my plays and execute my model. And I feel like as long as I execute my model and keep relentlessly refining and improving it, we're going to be successful. So it's hard, but it's not complicated.
Does your model also include some general ideas about certain spaces that you think are inevitably going to develop in the near future? You know, whether that be anti-aging technology or other things like that. Do you have these types of theses that a lot of investors have?
You know, it's funny. My answer to that will be kind of unsatisfying. You know, my view is that it's a people flow business and not a deal flow business, and that there's a small number of prime movers in the world who invent great things. And it's kind of axiomatic that those people will always predict the future better than I can. And so my job is to spot the people who are thinking in an exponential contrarian way and surprise me with an idea that's unexpected but super compelling. And we all have different ways to find those people. Anne tends to be more methodical. Anne's my partner, Anne Miraco. And Arjun tends to be more methodical. Anne calls me the truffle pig. You know, I just go around sniffing for truffles and try to meet smart people. And when I see a truffle, I start to wag my tail a lot. And everybody at FLOODGATE kind of surrounds me and they want to figure out if it's a real truffle. Whereas, you know, Anne's more likely to say, okay, I'm interested in big data. I'm going to find the 100 smartest people in big data and get to know them and develop a set of opinions about what's going to happen based on that. And, you know, there's no right way to be an investor, right? It's kind of like being a rock band. You got to find your own sound. And so, you know, I've always just had an ability to connect with founders. And so, you know, my whole thing is just find the very best founders of tomorrow and just count on the fact that when they start their companies that we'll get our share of it.
When you talk about monopoly and avoiding competition and all that, it's very reminiscent of Peter Thiel in many ways. Like, do you find that you, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, Chris Sacca, have a lot of things in common in terms of the way that you think about things, or that you actually disagree about some fundamental aspects?
Let's see. I think that we, as it relates to investing, agree for the most part. I would say that, you know, I respect different things about all of them. I think that what Peter is very good at is finding extraordinary people with contrarian insights. And I'd say that our views are similar in that regard, but Peter is more sort of willing to kind of venture off into kind of crazy areas. I'd say that Sacca's real talent actually is figuring out what products are going to be great and whether the founders are going to crush it. So I just think that Saka is a great product picker. And so, like, I think Saka understood that Uber would be meaningful, who's the other one?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. So I don't really think Saka invests quite the same way that Peter does or I do, but it works for him. And I think Andreessen is a little bit more of a momentum investor. So I think Andreessen will see something that's starting to work and put a huge amount of money and resource behind it, and just kind of like he's like goes all in on the poker hand if the first few cards are good.
Got it.
And they can all work, right? There's no right answer.
Got it. Are there other things that you wanted to cover? Or do you want us to go into questions?
I guess the only other thing I'd cover, and then let's do questions. You know, you're going to be surprised how short life is, and you know, before you know it, you're going to be at retirement age. And you know, I do a lot of stuff, you know, kind of in my spare time with like these charities, you know, like cancer charities or mental health charities or whatnot. And, you know, you're going to come to the end of the road someday. And when you come to the end of the road, you don't want to have regrets. And the only way I've ever figured out how to not have regrets, you know, the most inspiring words I ever heard were, "You will die." And the reason that they inspired me are, the paradox of that is that every day is a gift. And you have a decision about how you want to make the best use of the gift of your time that you have in this world. And my view has always been, spend that gift of time on things that you think have a chance to be kick-ass, exceptional, and truly legendary. Work with teams that you think are kick-ass. Work on projects that you think matter, that the world's going to have a give-a-shit factor about. Don't just do a startup, or don't just have a career, but like spend the limited time you're going to have on things where, you know, one day when you retire, you'll get to enjoy it twice because you get to remember what you did.
Do you think that, you know, it seems like a lot of people give this great advice, and then you know, sort of in day-to-day situations, people tend to forget that and tend to retreat into things that they're used to instead of sort of taking that risk or doing the more difficult things. Are there things that you do, or that, you know, the people that you coach or the founders that you coach do, in order to actually sort of take the more daring path or decision at the point when they take the decision?
Yeah, well, the thing that's helped me the most is I try to spend 15 minutes every morning on just what I call priming. You know, some people use that time for meditation, some people use it for whatever purpose. But like my use of that 15 minutes is to remind myself that I'm thankful for this day, and like, what am I going to do to make it exceptional? You know, what am I going to do? Like, I'm never going to get this day back. And so like, what am I going to do to say at the end of the day, that was a good day. I made the most of my gift of this day, and I didn't just sleepwalk through the day. And if there's things on my calendar that I'm like, why the hell am I doing this? Why am I working with this company anymore? Why am I meeting with this person? Why am I doing that thing? I'm very mindful of that, because nobody forces you to spend your time doing anything.
So since that probably involves saying no to a lot of meetings and no to a lot of entrepreneurs and all that, and in general, when you pass on companies, you know, decide not to spend time working with them, how do you pass on them, I suppose, while maintaining some sort of relationship, or diplomatically?
Yeah, well, very often I'll say, look, I just don't think this idea is worthy of your talent. And, you know, I hope you prove me wrong, but, you know, you're going to invest a whole lot of your time in this idea, and I just don't think it's good enough. And I'd love to back you when the idea is good enough.
Got it. Should we open up to questions from the class?
Let's do it.
Awesome. Moja.
Yeah, so EV Bolt Uber in China. I'm interested in learning your opinion on the competition between Uber and Lyft in the US. How do you think that's going to play out, and both domestically and globally?
Yeah, so I think that with Uber and Lyft, there are a couple of things that are interesting. Let me just describe what I think the dynamic is today, and then how I think it'll play out. I think Uber and Lyft are in a classic leader-challenger market. You know, so like some markets kind of winner take all, like Twitter was that way. Facebook was that way, right, for college social networking. LinkedIn was that way for professional social networking. I think that Uber and Lyft are going to be more like Coke and Pepsi, where both have a valid reason to succeed. You know, my guess is that Lyft is going to have more of a brand like Southwest Airlines and Virgin and stuff like that. And Uber is going to be more like American Airlines and United, right? They'll have more customers, but Lyft will probably have more fans. I also think that just because Uber is the company that it is, the world is not going to let there be just one Uber. I don't think governments will allow that to happen. I don't think that I don't think it's going to end up that way. So the important thing for Lyft is to get in a two-horse race with Uber and wear the white hat. You know, that's the way Lyft maximizes their opportunity. And right now, actually, they're gaining market share in the US. I think that's, by the way, one of the reasons Uber gave up in China. I think a combination of they weren't going to win in China, but they realized they were neglecting their flank in the US. I think over time, Uber will have to figure out how to fight a war on more fronts than Lyft. You know, Lyft is going to try to be the nice guys that partner with everybody, and Uber is going to challenge everybody in self-driving cars, and they're going to challenge everybody in ride sharing. And there's probably room in the market for both, and they probably both do fine, is my bet.
Aside, obviously, from the funding and your network, how do you think you best help founders? And do you think you're able to do that best as like a two-person team at Floodgate as opposed to like a huge firm like Andreessen? And like, what is the advantages of staying small and nimble?
Yeah, so like probably maybe I would describe like how I start out with folks. You know, whenever I invest in a company, I start out with 10 hours of what I call onboarding. There are usually 5 2-hour meetings. And, you know, I start out with each layer of the value stack. So I'll have 1 2-hour meeting that talks about competitive advantage and all the frameworks that I know that have worked among the very best companies about defining, developing, and extending competitive advantage. And then having a very sort of back and forth dialogue with the founder of what do we think our competitive advantage is, and really challenging them. And then the second meeting, I'll talk about product power. Are we really sure it's a WTF experience? Whereabouts is that true? What are the things that could prevent us from getting product market fit as soon as possible? Do we have a growth roadmap for this phase? The world-class companies that I've worked with in your market have gotten to X amount of users or Y amount of revenue this quickly. Can we do that? What would it take if the answer is yes? And then the third meeting will be about company power. I'll be like, okay, are you going to define your culture or just let it happen? And usually the founder will say, what do you mean define my culture? Like, that sounds kind of interesting. How would I do that? And then I'll walk them through how good companies have defined their culture, but more importantly, operationalized it and connected it to the business and made it tangible. I'll spend time, here are like the very best board decks I've ever seen with companies at your stage. Here are the types of meetings that I've seen good companies have and what got done in those meetings and who attended them and why they were useful. Here's what I've seen good companies do in goal setting. and how they followed through. And so I'll spend a few hours on that. And then I spend a few hours on category design, how we think about our market. What's our, is the market going to grow slow? In which case we need to get 100% share so that when the customers come to us, we'll be there. Or is the market right here, right now? We got to penetrate the market and capture it very quickly. But we have we come up with a growth hypothesis and then a category hypothesis. And then the last 2 hours are just kind of tying up loose ends. And it's interesting, like with Origin, with one of the recent companies, Chris was like, that is like the best 10 hours I have ever spent on startups in my life. And I was like, hey, it's a pretty low bar. VCs are kind of lame. And he goes, no, it wasn't with an investor. It was period. And so like, I just think that, in my experience, that has more of an impact on helping the founder and having a good relationship with the founder than having like a giant team of recruiters and, resources that you delegate that task to. So I look at, I kind of look at myself like I don't have an assembly line of suits, like I'm a bespoke tailor. And I try to work very closely with the founders sort of in that early, I'm more of a co-conspirator than an investor. And, eventually if it takes off, yeah, we'll bring in Benchmark or Andreessen or some of these guys. But in the early days, it's sort of like if the car crashes, I'm going through the windshield with them, And so that's, everybody's got their own style, but that's kind of what works for me. And, the rest of our team kind of has that philosophy. Otherwise, it wouldn't be at Floodgate.
Hi, I was wondering, you just described your 10-hour process that you go through with all the people you invest in. And for companies that you're competing with other VCs to invest in, how much of a difference do you think this process makes? And do you think that these founders talking with other people, or the word that goes around about the guidance you give the founders, does that help you
I think that in today's world, there's a lot more transparency about who the good people are and who isn't than there once was. I think 15 years ago, the founder was at a big disadvantage in knowing who was honest and who wasn't. I think in today's world that founders talk and they have ways to talk that they didn't have in the past. And there's, social networking and Twitter and all this stuff. I think that it's helped us, we've gotten most of the good deals we've seen have come in from founders. And, if you're involved with great companies, you're going to be involved with founders who see even better great companies. It's kind of a self-reinforcing kind of thing. But, I like to say, I try not to act like I'm a coach or a guide or any of that stuff. What the perspective I try to take with the founders, I try to say, look, this is your company. And I'm going to walk you through some things that I've learned that were true of other exceptional companies that I've seen and of great founders. It's totally up to you whether you want to use it or not. If you want to have a culture or don't want to have a culture, it's up to you. But what I don't want to make the mistake of is we have 50 employees and you say, damn, I wish you'd told me culture is important. So I'm going to explain to you why I think culture is important and what I've seen good companies do. But once I've explained it, it's totally up to you how you use it. And so what I try to do in those 10 hours is almost like a crash course of everything I've seen the exceptional companies do. And then what I try to do is I try to say, this isn't just platitudes and feel-good homilies. The reason we're spending 10 hours on this is if you decide you want to define a culture, let's talk exactly tangibly how we would do it at your company. given the employees that you have and the situation that you're in. And so, you know, good founders, they want to take it from the intangible principle to the tangible. So what exactly should I do if I want to do this? And so that's what we kind of debate in the 10 hours.
I have a quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
So you talked earlier about Twitch TV and how you kind of just like gave him money and let him run with it.
Yeah.
Did you take him through that same process? Is there some instances where you just
I did not. No, in the early days, I didn't. I made that mistake. And my most profound regret is not doing that with the Twitter guys early, because I think that we created a lot of organizational debt that was hard to fix later and persists to this day. And I feel like this is where Bill Campbell, you know, I don't know how many of you have heard of Bill Campbell. He's like the best all-time coach in Silicon Valley. He's on the board of Google and Apple at the same time, and helped the Twitter guys. And Bill took me aside one day and said, you know, Mike, you know, you have all these ideas of how you can help these companies. And I know that when you came to Silicon Valley, people said that you're an operator and not a stock picker, but you've proven that you know how to pick great companies. You need to get back to helping these founders understand how to build companies that are exceptional and not just in the right place at the right time. And so that's when I started to kind of get maniacal and committed to spending more time up front with these people.
To add to Parker's initial question, when you sit down with the companies, I suppose that sometimes there's less time to make your decision in terms of how many meetings or how much time you have with the founders if it's a particularly hot company or hot round. Do you even participate in those companies if you don't really get the chance to know the people? And what in general do you look for, or how do you, when an entrepreneur sits down with you, what are the questions that you ask in order to get the information that you want?
Usually I ask them questions that relate to their value stack. And what I find is that, so like if you're going to build a great company, you got to care about more than just the product. And the very great founders are constant learners, and they're always trying to learn about how to build a better company. And so like if I ask a founder questions, so for example, I don't know how many of you have heard of this company called Prisma, but it's kind of all the rage right now. And Alexei was coming by and talking to all these folks, all the familiar suspects. And he's like, okay, how much money would you like to invest in this round and all this stuff? And I said, hey, Alexei, look, I know what your product is and I know what round you're raising. Tell me what you're doing to define your culture. And what was interesting is he had an answer for that, which was I don't 100% agree with how he's thinking about it, but at least he was thinking about it. The good founders will say, well, why did you ask me that? And why do you think that's so important? And tell me examples of where you saw good cultures and why I should care. And what I find is that if I engage with founders that way, usually they'll see the difference. They'll say, okay, I want this person involved with my company because they're going to help me build a better company. And I usually say to founders, look, I'm going to succeed with or without you, and you'll probably succeed with or without me. And so it's just a question, do we want to work together? And we ought to just figure out what it takes to resolve that question. And usually I can figure that out in 2 or 3 meetings.
What are some of the other questions that you like to ask them that are perhaps not some of the more common questions?
What is the most excellent situation you've ever been in your life? And why was it thus? What else? But for the most part, I'll ask, what is your structural competitive advantage? That even if everybody decides you're right, that there's no way they can copy it. Yeah. But also it's hard to say, like you know, some musicians follow the page of notes. I'm more improvisational jazz when I'm talking to founders.
Isabella.
You said earlier about in your conversation with Ben of Pinterest of how he gave you that really rare feeling of like, this guy's gonna be famous, this guy's gonna be huge. What did Ben exactly do or say that gave you that effect that very few other people can impart on you?
He just had an incredibly clear idea of what he was building and why. And it was obvious to me that he not only did he have a clear idea that was right, but that he was going to be able to tune out all the chattering noise around him, which is especially important in consumer.
And why did no one see that in Ben before he had traction? I hear the story of Pinterest of how he struggled for, I think, maybe almost a year.
And guys, I just realized I'm late for a meeting. I'm sorry. They're just knocking on me.
Good last question.
You know, yeah, he changed. Why don't I take one more question, then I got to go, unfortunately.
Sounds good. Lucas.
How do you decide when a startup's ready for investment? Like you brought up Airbnb and kind of the process you went through there.
Gosh, I wish I knew. You just get a sense, right? You just, you know, for better or worse, I've spent my entire career on startups. And, you know, I know what I like. And when I see something I like, I tend to learn to listen to that. So and then when I like, and then I have to apply my tools to comprehend my ignorance. Usually I fall irrationally in love too quickly. And then I have to slow down and ask myself the 20 questions to make sure I'm not talking myself into, you know, that I'm really in love and not in lust with this startup.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us. This was really great.
All right, thanks for your time. Good luck.